Good evening. I'm Deborah Nelson. I'm the Dean of the Division of Humanities. And it's my immense pleasure to welcome you to the lecture of U Chicago Paleography and the Book Visiting Scholar Program, sponsored by the University of Chicago Division of Humanities. A renowned visiting professor, Peter Kornicki, will spend this evening on the cultural history of Japan, particularly its fascinating history of printing and manuscript books. During his time here this spring, Peter has already discovered in our own special collections 4 remarkable uncatalogued books that we will soon share with a wider audience. His focus today is on exposing the underworld of manuscript books dealing with secret knowledge, shocking scandals, and obscure rituals. Before my colleague Hoyt Long introduces Peter, let me briefly acknowledge how significant a year we've had leading into Peter's talk. As many of you know, Paleography in the Book Visiting Scholar is funded by Hannah Holberg Gray, who's right here, who conceived this initiative and has provided us with most generous support. It's not surprising that Hannah initiated the idea. She is the Harry Pratt Distinguished Service Professor Emeritus of History, and as you may know, she served as president of the university from 1978 to 1993. Given her expertise in the history of humanism, political and historical thought, and church history and politics in the Renaissance and Reformation, it's clear why early histories of printing and of the book figure prominently in her scholarship. As Hannah will recall, 5 years ago, she first suggested the idea of a course of instruction that would immerse students in the study of manuscripts and books through time and cultures. As we tried to imagine what this might look like, we realized how well an annual visiting professorship could serve our faculty and students. This summer, Hannah and I had lunch to discuss the future of this initiative and whether it had a place in my plans as a new dean. I brought along Eric Slaughter, who sadly, very sadly for Eric, can't be here because in France, actually that's sad. He painstakingly researched the faculty websites of all of our faculty to see who might be interested in paleography in the book. As it turns out, many faculty and graduate students were interested. With Eric's leadership, they have formed a vibrant collective that has met regularly all year, brings in speakers, shares work, and will now host a rare book short course in special collections this summer. In other words, Paleography in the Book Visiting Professor and Lecturer has catalyzed a vibrant, ongoing collaboration among faculty and graduate students, which is generating new research and new plans for teaching the history of the book. I know many members of this group are here today, and I congratulate you on your efforts this year and look forward to things to come. The program reflects the commitment of the University of Chicago and the Division of the Humanities to the proposition that a thorough understanding of original sources, the languages in which they were communicated, the means through which they were represented, and the contexts in which they arose are the indispensable tools of humanistic inquiry. This commitment resonates throughout the division and its history, in the division's production of outstanding critical editions, in the belief in the relevance of studying and preserving languages, no matter how ancient, and in our insistence that scholars and students must have a deep command of and respect for primary sources and the condition under which they were created. The history of what we might call the visible world encompasses venerable scholarly fields ranging across peoples and epochs, such as manuscript studies of the Bible and its reception, papyri in ancient Mediterranean civilizations, manuscripts in Sanskrit, Tamil, and many other languages and dialects, illuminating manuscripts of the medieval era, the development of printing and the flowering of print culture, and the practices of readers, to name just a few. Through Paleography in the Books Visiting Scholar Program, we help these areas thrive. I'm pleased to introduce my colleague Hoyt Long, Professor and Chair of the Department of East Asian Languages and Civilizations.
Thank you, Debbie. It's my great pleasure to be able to introduce our speaker tonight, Peter Kornicki, who comes to us from the University of Cambridge, where he's Emeritus Professor of Japanese Studies. He's been on campus since March, teaching what, by all accounts, has been a riveting class on the history of the book in Japan from the earliest times to the 1890s. I know it's been an incredible treat for our students to have one of the foremost experts in the field guide them through this history with materials from our own special collections, as well as items from his personal library. And as Debbie mentioned, I think it's been a real treat for him to peruse our collections, because he's found a number of treasures that we didn't even know we had, which is wonderful. So Peter, as I've already alluded, is one of the world's leading experts on the history of the book in Japan, and certainly the leading expert outside of Japan. He earned his degree in Japanese literature at Oxford in the late 1970s, after which he went off to take his first teaching post at the University of Tasmania. After 4 years there, where, by his own account, he acquired a taste for Australian wine and bushwalking, he took a position at Kyoto University until 1985, and then at that point was hired at the university as a lecturer at Cambridge. Throughout this time and beyond, Peter was conducting important original research across a diverse range of areas of history of the book in the Edo period, including censorship, the distribution of both printed and manuscript books by commercial lending libraries, provincial publishing, and the reprinting of Edo books in the Meiji period. Together with the scholar Hayashi Nozomu, he edited a major catalog in 1991, the Early Japanese Books in Cambridge University Library, which offers in its notes one of the most thorough expositions of pre-modern Japanese bibliography available in English. Later, he went on, also with Hayashi, to direct the Union Catalog of Early Japanese Books in Europe, an ambitious project to catalog the many pre-modern Japanese books housed in European collections. This research and cataloging work culminated in Peter's masterpiece, The Book in Japan, A Cultural History from the Beginnings to the 19th Century, which was published by Brill in 1998. The book is a nearly 500-page encyclopedic survey of the history of physical texts in Japan, covering nearly everything one might want to know about how printed materials were made, circulated, archived, and politically controlled up to 1900. For scholars of Japan like myself, it's no exaggeration to say that the book serves as a kind of Bible. When I began work, for example, on an essay about changing conceptions of handwriting in the Meiji period and how typographic printing was reshaping perceptions of the written word, it was Peter's book to which I turned in order to get the most thorough account of the historical relationship between writing and print. If Google Scholar is to be trusted, many have likewise turned to his book as the authoritative source. Apparently it's been cited over 500 times, which I'm sure is an undercount. It's important to note that it wasn't only scholars of Japan to whom Peter directed his magisterial work. His ambitions were always much greater, and he sought to situate Japan within a much broader global history of the book, one from which it, and East Asia in general, had long been excluded or treated as mere footnote. There's a reviewer of Peter's book when it first came out who recalled that one of the books that inaugurated the field of book history, which was Febre and Martin's The Coming of the Book from 1958, in that book, the book in East Asia was relegated to a 6-page section by a specialist at the Bibliothèque Nationale who grudgingly granted China a, quote, indirect connection via the invention of paper, asserting furthermore that, quote, nothing so far suggests that we owe China any more than that, end quote. We have come a long way since then, in large part because of the rigorous and path-breaking research of scholars like Peter, who has helped us to see why the complex history of manuscript and printing culture in Japan and East Asia matter to a truly global history of the book. Peter's continued to publish and catalog prolifically since The Book in Japan. In addition to numerous articles, he's contributed to 2 important volumes on the history of the book in East Asia and The Female as Subject, Women and the Book in Japan. He's also served since 2011 as the managing editor of the journal East Asian Publishing and Society. I've learned so much from Peter's work over the years, and I'm thrilled that you'll all have a chance to benefit from his immense wisdom tonight as he helps answer this question: why did Matsudaira Sadanobu copy the Tale of Genji 7 times? Please join me in welcoming Peter.
I've never been credited with having written the Bible before. I think I'll add that to my CV. First of all, my warmest thanks to Professor Hannah Holborn-Gray, to Dean Deborah Nelson, and to the entire humanities community here at the University of Chicago for having invited me to fill this position. It has been an honour to have this really great opportunity to teach and research here for the spring quarter, and I truly am deeply grateful. It has also been a delight to have the run of the Hannah Holborn Gray Special Collections Research Centre, teaching under the gaze of Abraham Lincoln in that unusual portrait of him without a beard. And I should like to record my huge debt to Catherine Ecker and her staff in the Special Collections Research Centre. Finally, my deep thanks also to Ayako Yoshimura, who I think is somewhere here today, the Japanese librarian in the Regenstein, for her cheerful collaboration throughout my time here. Let me start from a rather unexpected angle. My father was born in Poland, hence my Polish surname, and in 1982 I had a roots moment. Alex Haley's book of that title had only come out in 1976 and was still being talked about. So I began learning Polish. Believe me, Japanese is a lot easier. And I went to Poland in 1983 to visit my cousins, uncles and aunts for the first time. While I was there, I got to know Professor Henryk Lipschitz, who was teaching history of Japanese theatre at the University of Warsaw, but he was also a very active Solidarity representative. Remember, in 1983, the year I visited, Solidarity had already been banned and Poland was under martial law. Henryk was very careful, but he was eventually later imprisoned and only released in 1989 when the regime collapsed after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Anyway, Henryk knew of my interest in the history of the book and asked if I would like to see an underground publishing operation at work, and I naturally said yes. To be honest, I was really expecting something like this. I missed the first something like this. A small, low-tech operation. After all, the state controlled access to printing and binding machinery, supplies of paper and so on, so how could it be otherwise? Actually, the cover to this book is completely misleading. It shows a hand press producing posters. In fact, there was a vibrant alternative supply of print which was invisible in bookshops, but nevertheless formed a huge presence in Poland under martial law, and it consisted of books and magazines like this. How all this was achieved is still a bit of a mystery to me, but as you can see, the underground publishers had access to colour printing and could produce book covers with what were then rather sophisticated designs. It was the same also in the GDR, called East Germany, and China, and probably most of the East Bloc, and I've put a few examples up here. Now, these various books and magazines produced by underground or unofficial public publishers expose the relative invisibility of underground printed material in the days of the Soviet bloc. But actually, a similar kind of invisibility is also a feature of many pre-modern societies around the globe, especially the so-called print cultures. Now, that label, it seems to me, sits uncomfortably with the fact that textual culture in those societies was routinely produced both in manuscript and in print, to say nothing of oral production. The scholarly tide is slowly turning now. Ever since Harold Love wrote his path-breaking monograph on scribal publication in 1993, the body of scholarship has been growing, as you can see here, although it is still limited in scope and mostly confined to literary manuscripts. That is largely because research has been driven by literary specialists. But the concentration on literature leaves the full extent of scribal culture in many of these societies as a parallel to print culture completely unexplored. As I will show in Japan, the non-literary manuscripts are just as important. In his fascinating book, Ways of Writing, published in 2008 and listed here, David Hall took up the case of John Winthrop, one of the founders of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, as you all know. Winthrop is well known today for having declared in a sermon in 1630 that the colonists would build a city upon a hill. This sermon did not in fact appear in print for 160 years, and was first printed in 1790, so it is tempting to conclude that it was not as widely known to contemporaries as it is to us today. However, David Hall shows that it circulated in manuscript form throughout the 1630s and 1640s. In fact, throughout the 17th century, there was in New England a thriving production of manuscripts expressing political or religious dissent, and this was happening at the same time as printing began in 1638 to supplement imports from across the Atlantic. This phenomenon, the coexistence of print and manuscript, was also a feature of Renaissance Italy, of 18th century Cairo, of 19th century Iceland, and particularly of 17th century England, and it is in its English setting that it has been most thoroughly examined, albeit, as I said, mostly in connection with literary writings. Of course, Japan was no exception to this phenomenon of the coexistence of print and manuscript. But this side of the commerce and ecology of the book in Japan in the Edo period from 1600 to 1868 has remained invisible and largely overlooked in the history of the book in Japan, just as it has in China and Korea. The standard narrative goes like this. The Edo period was the age in which commercial printing took off. It was during the Edo period that printed books were profusely illustrated by the most famous artists of their day like Hokusai and Hiroshige, and that printed books spread to all corners of Japan. This was, we are told, the era of the printed book in Japan. But that narrative only works if you ignore all the manuscript books that continue to be produced and that survive in great abundance today, and there's a small sample here. I first wrote about this subject in 2006, but have recently come back to it after realizing that I had grossly underestimated the scale of manuscript production in Japan. Right, now to the subject you want an answer to. In the abstract for this lecture, I referred to Matsudaira Sadanobu. I will call him Sadanobu from now on. He was the de facto ruler of Japan from 1787 to 1793, when he was forced to resign. In his retirement years, he copied out, by hand, the voluminous text, over 1,000 pages in translation, of the Tale of Genji, 7 times, and he could not remember how many times he had copied out the Tales of Ise, a shorter work, both of these works from the 11th century. He also copied at least 200 other works, several of them more than once, and again, all in his own hand. He didn't depute this to a scribe, he did it himself. Why did he need to do this if print really was so well established in Japan? Well before his times, the classic works of Japanese literature had already appeared. I need to move the slide forward, there we are. Well before his time, the classic works of Japanese literature had already appeared in numerous printed editions from the early 1600s onwards, and there can be no doubt that Sadanobu had the means and the opportunity to acquire as many copies as he wanted. So his reason for making copies cannot have been textual scarcity or personal poverty. Again, what was he up to and why? What you see here are 2 of the 7 copies of the Tale of Genji that he prepared, both attractively and expensively bound, as you can see, and the minuscule one on the right is presented in a lacquer cabinet. These are the only 2 of the 7 that are accessible. One more is in a remote library, another appeared recently in a antiquarian bookseller's catalogue, and the whereabouts of the other 3 are unknown. Now, there are several important points about these manuscript books I want to draw your attention to straight away. Firstly, they are not copies of printed books. On the contrary, they are copies of different manuscripts of greater antiquity than the printed editions. In fact, Sadanobu's personal copy of the Tale of Genji was a manuscript dating from the 13th century, and it is now regarded as one of the oldest of the extant copies. Secondly, with just a few exceptions, the texts he was copying came from the Japanese literary tradition. This is interesting, for he had been at the head of a regime which encouraged sinological studies and the reading of Chinese texts, and he himself had imposed strict Neo-Confucian orthodoxy on the official academies. What is more, Confucian moralists at the heart of the regime had long regarded the Tale of Genji as a dissolute work of fiction, and yet he clearly valued it highly enough to copy it out not once but 7 times. Thirdly, given the care given to their binding, these were clearly not just a writing exercise. We don't know what he intended for the copy he made, but it is probable that he gave them away, for the only ones that remained in his family archive are these 2. Fourthly and finally, he began his activity on being hounded out of his position. Copying out texts was not something he had done before, and it is perhaps reasonable to suppose that it was his forced retirement that may have had something to do with this, though of course post hoc is not necessarily propter hoc. So then, how do we explain all this retirement copying activity? Sadanobu was very conscious of the fact that what he was doing was a bit extreme, and he declared that he suffered from copying sickness, shabyo, a compulsive desire to make handwritten copies of the books he valued. 2 angles are worth considering briefly before we move on to see him in the larger context of scribal culture in Edo period Japan. Firstly, on a personal level, he may have been seeking solace or an escape from his years at the top of government after his dismissal. This is pure speculation, of course, but Sadanobu's obsession with copying calls to mind the clerk in Bleak House, and especially the 2 characters in Flaubert's last novel, Bouvard et Pécuchet, who similarly, after some very difficult and trying times, find great solace in the act of copying out texts. It also calls to mind Johannes Trithemius's book, In Praise of Scribes, which was published in 1494. Trithemius clearly saw copying as something other than a purely mechanical task. He put it like this: sitting in peace and solitude, the scribe is gradually led thereby to an understanding of the mysteries of the text. Then inwardly he or she is greatly enlightened. For those things that we copy, we impress more deeply in the mind. I must give this a try sometime. Secondly, since he deliberately chose different manuscripts to copy, which he had to borrow from acquaintances, there was an element of study in this activity. Copying was far from unusual as a scholarly activity in Japan as elsewhere. For example, the Confucian scholar Nakae Toju in the 17th century listed attending lectures, close textual study, and copying texts as the inevitable daily tasks of a scholar. And to move a couple of centuries further, the diary of a student at the Government Academy in the early 19th century mentions that his main activity for each day in his diary. Sometimes it's composing poetry in Chinese, sometimes it's reading texts, sometimes it's doing boring guard duty, and of course sometimes it's copying out texts. So Sadanobu, by making copies of different manuscripts, was in a sense studying them. The manuscripts he copied came with a provenance that Sadanobu carefully noted in each copy he made. It is likely that he considered them more authoritative than a printed version based on who knows what manuscript. Good manuscripts came with a pedigree. Printed books did not, and that was a consideration that carried weight in Japan until modern scholarship took over. Sadanobu was far from being the only one to be engaged in this kind of activity. Here are 2 examples from the Art Institute of Chicago, which I examined recently. The one on the left is 1 volume of a luxury set of the Tale of Genji in 54 volumes, written on smooth paper of the highest quality, with hand-painted illustrations and gold decorations, as you can see. Unfortunately, the scribes and the artists involved completely effaced themselves, so we don't know when it was made nor by whom. This copy was produced a little before Sadanobu's time, earlier in the 18th century, but nevertheless long after printed editions had become easily available, and in this case it was most likely produced as a wedding gift to the daughter of some extremely high-ranking person. The one on the right on the slide here, the Tales of Ise, was copied by somebody in 1652 with some care. And again, this work had been available in print from 1615 onwards. So why did this man have to copy it out at the age of 78? These few examples are enough to make us pause over the standard narrative of Edo period Japan as a print society, and to encourage us to uncover the hidden side of the book world of the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries. But if we're going to try to uncover the world of the manuscript book, where can we find the evidence? And what is the state of the archive? One of the most useful tools available to us is the National Database of Japanese Books, which, for all its shortcomings, provides the locations of copies of all pre-modern books in Japan. It is also searchable in various ways. If you search by category, such as medicine, flower arrangement or surveying, then you find that no more than 20% of the titles listed are printed books. The remainder, 80% of the titles, are manuscript books. Now that's pretty surprising to start with, but that database, if anything, under-records the levels of manuscript production because the database compilers have not travelled to all the provincial libraries which carry huge numbers of these manuscripts, many not recorded elsewhere. What is more, not a few of those manuscripts survive in more than 100 copies. Compare that with two Japanese books in the Regenstein Library, one printed in 1686 and the other in 1718, which I came across recently. They survive nowhere else, not even in Japan. And yet, histories of Japanese book culture focus exclusively on print. Let us look at two more bits of quantitative data. Firstly, in this map, which I initially made in 2006 but have added to substantially since then, you can see the locations where copies of a manuscript titled Keian Taihiki, which I've given a few details about on the slide, were made or owned in the Edo period. Now, compiling this map has required a great deal of legwork on my part, because most of these copies are not actually listed on the national database at all. I found them by going around small provincial libraries. Now, about 100 copies that I found, or have found so far, had the requisite information about the place where it was made and the date where it was copied or passed to a new owner. And that information enabled me to place them in particular localities in Edo period Japan, as you can see here. Another 100 copies I've encountered carried no such information, so I had to leave them out. So we learned that this particular text, which is a partly fictionalized account of a rebellion that took place in 1651, circulated all over Japan, and that at least 200 copies were made in the Edo period, probably far more. Secondly, there is the percentage of manuscripts that make up personal book collections. Whether we turn to individuals of high status or low status, individuals in rural settings or in urban settings, the collections without fail include large numbers of manuscripts, as you can easily see from these few examples. In the case of number 3, the Hatta family, the books themselves don't actually survive, but a list of their books does. Several of the titles listed are manuscripts that are no longer extant and cannot be found anywhere. So the obvious question is, what are all these manuscripts and why are they being copied? Let me answer that question by examining some examples, some of them taken from the Chicago area. One of the reasons for producing a manuscript book and not seeking to have it printed is that it is of purely local interest, like this example. The only reason works like this could not be printed was inadequacy of the projected readership. The same goes for local histories, which are legion, and for local school textbooks. These textbooks gave children the local information they needed, like the names of nearby villages, the names of important local officials, the principal products of the area, local agricultural terminology, or alternatively, in the case of a harbour town, local maritime terminology, the names of boats, the names of cargoes, and so on. Almost all manuscripts of this kind are the work of local authors, and the books they produced had a purely local circulation. Most of them survive in unique copies, so it is not difficult to suppose that a great deal has been lost. A very important motive for avoiding print was censorship, just as it was in 17th and 18th century France for opponents of the Ancien Régime and for the works of the Lumière, and just as it was in early 18th century England for Jacobite sympathisers. In Japan, political scandals, sensational events, and anything involving the upper echelon of the samurai class were all banned from print, as was anything concerning Christianity and foreign countries. Well, East Asian countries were allowed, but other countries not. Let's examine 4 examples to make this a bit more concrete. This manuscript that you can see on the slide is one of those that features in the map I just showed you of the distribution of that book, Keian Taiheiki. There is another one here on the table, by the way, on the bottom left corner. Note that the owner of this copy has written his name and village inside the front cover. He was evidently not worried that ownership of this book might get him into trouble, and I'm grateful to him for having done that because it enabled me to include him in my map. In this case, the individual wrote the date in his name but omitted his village, so I could not include it in the map. This is one of the many manuscripts relating to Christianity that were in circulation in Japan. As most of you may know, Christianity was introduced to Japan in the late 16th century and flourished for a while, but then was extirpated in the first half of the 17th century. There were expulsions of missionaries, there were executions of missionaries, converts were persuaded to apostatize or executed. So Christianity was placed under a very severe ban, and Japanese were forbidden to have any Christian books whatsoever. And yet, here we have one example. There are many others, and the owner in this case has very kindly, thinking of future researchers, written his name and address in the bottom left corner. The Bakufu, the samurai government of Edo period Japan, did issue bans on these manuscripts, but as governments in the Soviet Union, East Germany and other repressive regimes have found, manuscripts are not as easy to control as printed books, and policing them is difficult. And it's for this reason, as a recent book has made clear, that Uyghur textual culture is being preserved by shifting back to the manuscript, because manuscripts are much harder to control. This, on the other hand, is one of a number of manuscripts on the sensational sex scandal involving ladies from the Shogun's court, which came to light in 1803. They were supposed to be attending midnight services, but other things were actually going on. In the aftermath of this scandal, the Bakufu government learnt 2 years later that manuscript accounts were circulating and cracked down on them. Copyists and book rental merchants who had commissioned the copies were punished, but not owners of manuscript copies, for how could they be traced? This was one of the rare occasions when manuscripts fell foul of the law, but there were many other copies in existence by then, and so eradication of all copies was completely out of the question. A slightly different case is this. Now, for most of the Edo period, travel abroad was punishable by death. There was an exception for a small number of privileged people who could travel to Korea, but other than that, travel abroad was punishable by death. People who were shipwrecked in foreign countries, mostly Kamchatka and from there to Russia, were not, however, held accountable for their accidental travel. All the same, knowledge about foreign countries was mostly excluded from the domain of print. So this was one area of knowledge that you could only get from manuscript books written by castaways who had returned home. And this was one example, one of a very large number of such books. That there was a demand for them is obvious. More than 100 copies of this work are extant and listed in the national database, but there are also many in collections outside Japan, including in the USA, Arizona, and the Tress collection at the University of Pennsylvania. Moving on from these kind of books that were produced to evade censorship, there were many other areas of knowledge that were circulating only in the form of manuscript books, but not for reasons connected with censorship. Some of these manuscript books were related to technical developments, to inventions, or to some kind of special knowledge, and they were deliberately not published so as to protect their economic value. Let me illustrate what I mean by way of a parallel. The Chamberlain family of Huguenot surgeons who fled from Paris to England in the 17th century invented obstetric forceps, and they kept them as a family professional secret for at least 200 years. The forceps were hidden in a huge box, roughly 2 feet cubed, when they went to the homes of their patients, and they went so far as to blindfold their patients to preserve the secret of the obstetric forceps and to preserve their monopoly and therefore their income. Similarly, Edward Jenner's decision to make his vaccination technique public was made in the conscious knowledge that he could have made a fortune if he had kept it secret, but he didn't. In Japan, the collective name for this type of restricted knowledge is hiden, or secret traditions. One of the most famous examples is that of the development of anesthesia for surgery in 1804, well before ether was used for that purpose in the US and the UK in the 1840s. But many other kinds of medical knowledge were similarly kept out of the public domain, recorded in manuscripts and transmitted orally. Pupils paid to attend the lessons and to acquire the knowledge, and those who reached the required standard were permitted to copy the master manuscript. In the Tress collection at the University of Pennsylvania, there is a particularly fine authorized copy of an illustrated account of that first operation performed in 1804 using anesthesia. I could have shown it to you today, but it really is too gory to show to a public audience. These manuscripts were initially made, therefore, in order to codify and to preserve knowledge. Copying was restricted, as colophons at the end of these manuscripts often mentioned. You can see here 2 examples. But some authorized copies were made, and doubtless some unauthorized secondary copies as well. So most such manuscripts, in fact, survive today in multiple copies. Let's look at a few examples. Ikebana, or flower arrangement, was one of many traditions where knowledge about techniques and taste were transmitted to pupils orally and preserved in manuscripts, and to some extent that is still true today. The number of different schools in each field of knowledge transmission increased during the Edo period, and there can be no doubt that the narcissism of small difference was very often in operation. However, this example on the screen is an earlier one, from before the proliferation of schools of Ikebana. The colophon of this Ikebana manuscript tells us that the text was written in 1536 and that in 1544 one named individual was permitted to make this copy. Here is another view of it. Now, this manuscript transmits the secrets of the Yui Shinken school of flower arrangement. This school was suppressed by the Ikenobo school of flower arrangement, which is still dominant today. In fact, so successful has the suppression been that this is now the only witness to the Yuishin school of flower arrangement, which flourished in 16th century Japan. The variety of knowledge transitions that were kept secret but preserved in the form of manuscript books is so vast that I can only mention a few today, and in fact I don't myself have a good grasp of the entire extent of that variety. This is a most unusual example which I recently encountered up the road in Evanston, and it covers hairdressing techniques, including hair extensions, as you can see here. But many of the traditions preserved in this way and codified in this way were scientific or medical, and the next 2 examples will illustrate that. Surveying techniques were treated in Japan and China as a branch of mathematics. The Japanese National Database lists 894 titles relating to surveying, but only around 50 of them were printed in the Edo period, and most of those were in fact printed in the 1850s, so the overwhelming bulk of the titles in circulation were manuscript books. In order to trace the development of surveying techniques in Japan, therefore, it's obviously necessary to pursue the manuscripts. The library of one of the leading surveyors of 18th century Japan, Ishiguro Nobuyoshi of Toyama, survives intact, along with his record of who he lent his books to and why. And from this we can see that he owned a couple of printed books, but also a very large number of manuscripts, and that he was at the centre of a book lending circle. Mostly he was lending the books out, he did borrow a few. That circle included many high-ranking samurai who were willing to pay him to be allowed to borrow his books to make their own copies, but humbler folk were allowed to copy his books free of charge. A progressive man. This manuscript was made by Ikeda Zuisen, a government-appointed physician with a special expertise in smallpox. He produced this record of his observation of symptoms of lips and tongues, and he wrote various treatises on the symptoms of smallpox, but none of them were published, probably because he was in government employ. And this particular manuscript survives in just 2 other copies, which are probably made by other physicians, but there's nothing to indicate for sure. Another area was schools of military science. These proliferated too, each offering slight variants on the same skills: sword fighting, archery, horse riding, spear stabbing, and many other unpleasant skills. The particularities of each school were incorporated in manuscripts like this that became a valued record of what distinguished each school, and there are several similar manuscripts in the Regenstein. Let's now put these secret traditions to one side and consider one different type of manuscript. As I mentioned earlier, when Matsudaira Sadanobu made those copies of the Tale of Genji, he was not copying printed editions, but rather old manuscripts. Nevertheless, copying printed books was in fact a widespread practice in Japan, as it was in many other societies too. Manuscripts of this sort have mostly been ignored, though they often have a great deal to tell us. But why was copying of printed books undertaken at all? Sometimes it was occasioned by the difficulty of obtaining printed copies in remote areas, or because the book was a rarity, or because you lacked the means to buy too many books. Let's start off with this rather puzzling example. There are in fact very few extant manuscripts which contain Chinese texts like this. This is a copy of the anthology of Tang poetry, as the slide tells you. There were innumerable different editions on the market, and in fact Chinese editions like this, made for Japanese readers, were the mainstay of commercial publishing throughout the Edo period. And this particular work, the anthology of Tang poetry, was never out of print in the Edo period. So it was always possible to get a printed copy if you wanted one. So this copy was probably made in circumstances where a printed copy was a rarity or unobtainable, perhaps a remote or isolated community where there was one copy which others could borrow and copy for themselves. The printed original from which this copy was made was an edition prepared for Japanese readers, and so it had various printed glosses to help them make sense of the Chinese poems that you can see in these little marks here and there. It looks a bit like a spider crawled over the text. And the copyist has laboriously copied those out in order to be able to take advantage of those glosses that made it much easier to read the Chinese text. Here we have a printed edition of a treatise on the costumes mentioned in the Pillar Book of Seishonogon, and a manuscript copy made more than 60 years later. In fact, it's on display here. And since it was made more than 6 years later, it's possible that the printed edition had already become rather hard to get hold of. As you can see, I hope, the manuscript copy follows the layout, the orthography, and even the calligraphic style of the original. And this is probably a professional copy made to order. And the next one certainly is. This is a copy of Book 6 and Book 6 only of an album by the famous artist Nishikawa Skenobu, which was published in 1742. The copy is so exact that it is difficult to tell which is the copy and which is the printed book. Am I right? But if you look at the right-hand edges, you will see that the printed version has a title on the fold at the edge of the page, but the copyist, that is the top copy, left that out. Most probably this was professionally made to fill a gap in an incomplete set. Next, I would like to turn briefly to the authorship, reproduction and circulation of manuscript books in Japan. Most of the scholarship on manuscript books in the age of print in Europe and North America focus on literary works that were circulated among select groups of readers. Amongst these are literary writings by women, which in England tended to circulate only in the form of manuscripts. This phenomenon has, as most of you probably know, been attributed to what is called the stigma of print. But this is a somewhat problematic term because such a stigma, if indeed there was one, did not apply only to women. And so recent scholarship has rather argued that manuscript circulation should be considered more of a choice, and that it is not appropriate to see a manuscript version as representing a failure to be printed. Be that as it may, in Japan too, women's prose writings and most poetry remained unpublished in their lifetimes, and it is only as a result of archival exploration that their works have come to light in the last 20 years or so. But let me emphasize, it was not only women writers who went unpublished. And in Japan, as elsewhere, it's very difficult to find evidence that makes it precisely clear what is the reason for refraining from having their works printed. There were also elite writers who chose to publish none or few of their writings, such as Niccolò Machiavelli, whose most well-known work, The Prince, circulated in manuscript until 1532, 5 years after his death, when it was first printed. A similar example from Japan is illustrated here. The famous sinologist Auguste Orai incorporated his views on government reform in a book entitled Political Discussions, Seidan, in the 1720s, and he submitted it directly to the shogun, since he had the right of audience. He intended to burn his personal copy, and he may well have done so. Even his two closest followers did not know of the existence of this work until many years later. Nevertheless, it circulated widely in manuscript until a printed edition finally appeared more than 100 years later in 1859. Today, around 100 copies can be traced, manuscript copies, and even a lowly policeman in Osaka had one in the 1830s. I'm rather reminded of Harold Love's reference in his book on scribal publication to, and I quote, the apparently paradoxical notion of publication through a single copy. In this case, the single copy given to the shogun. How it got out is not clear. It's very likely that the shogun had copies made to discuss its contents with his advisors, but there is no evidence to show that that was the case. Somehow or other, it escaped. And as I said, a number of copies can be traced today. In this particular copy, there's a rather interesting note in red at the end to the effect that manuscript transmission is very unreliable, often leads to errors, and that the manuscript from which this copy was made was full of errors. And so the copyist consulted a better one that he found and corrected all the errors. The manuscript medium also afforded opportunities for many common writers, as they've recently been termed, to write. These common writers were unlikely to be able to get a book published because of their status, because of where they lived, because of their lack of literary gifts, or because of the private nature of their writings. Here is one Japanese example that I've taken from the Newbery Library. The writer's name is not recorded, but he seems to have been very nervous about his great responsibility as intendant or supervisor of the shogun's storehouses. He made this record, as he explains in the preface, as a personal reminder of the most important objects that were under his care and what they should look like. His calligraphic and artistic skills were, as you can see, quite remarkable, but his identity is untraceable. And there are many other examples of such common writers who were producing books, particularly people such as the heads of villages who wrote histories of their villages or accounts of the villagers' rights to common land and the like. As I've already mentioned, many manuscripts circulated widely, and they can therefore be said to have been published. They were reproduced when individuals copied them, and it is clear from colophons, diaries, letters and other such sources that it was very common practice to borrow manuscripts in order to make copies. The frequent repetition of this process enabled manuscripts to reach most parts of Japan, as you will recall from the map I showed you earlier. But not all copying was done by amateurs. By the 1690s there were professionals who could do the copying for you, and it's clear that this was already an established practice by then, so doubtless it must have started much earlier. Alternatively, professionals could sell you manuscript copies of rare manuscripts or printed books. The finer the hand and the better quality the paper, the more costly, of course. You could also buy them ready-made from bookshops or borrow them from book rental merchants. And this bookshop flyer shows you that manuscripts were a normal part of the fare that was available to buy from this particular bookshop, which was somewhere in Osaka. In other words, manuscript books were a normal part of the book trade, traded and lent just like printed books. Now let me begin to draw this talk to a conclusion. I've been arguing that the production of manuscript books in Edo period Japan was at the same level as print, and the sheer quantities of them bear this out. The best estimate, and it's not my estimate, is that there were as many manuscript books in circulation as printed books. I do not want to suggest that there was a huge divide between print and manuscript in those centuries, however. This is because the dominant printing technology was woodblock printing. This involves making a neat copy by hand of the work to be printed, pasting that copy onto wooden blocks and carving away the white parts to leave the text in relief. It will be obvious, therefore, that woodblock printing is in effect a technology for the reproduction of handwriting, as you can see from this example in the Regenstein Library. So reading in Edo period Japan necessarily involved coming to grips with handwriting, no matter whether you were reading printed books or manuscript books. That said, most book history and literary scholarship in Japan has focused on the printed books of the Edo period, and most of the manuscript books have been ignored with just a few exceptions. One of those exceptions is literary works and other writings by women, which in the last 25 years have been extensively reprinted and studied. Also, some of the fictionalized narratives of scandals have also been gathering a bit of attention. These narratives were considered to be an integral part of the literature of the Edo period up to around 1900, but since then they've been pushed into the background in favour of the printed literature of the Edo period. So you can't find reprints of these fictionalized scandals, you can't find annotated editions of them, but that is not the case when the books were printed. There are any number of book-length studies of print culture. There are any number of book-length studies of print culture in the Edo period, in Japanese, 3 in English, 1 in French, 1 in German, but none whatsoever of the vibrant scribal culture that I've just drawn a quick sketches of in this lecture. My current book, not yet published, represents an attempt to make good that imbalance. All those scandal narratives, together with Sadanobu's copies of the Tale of Genji, the innumerable manuscript books written by common writers, and the manuscript books recording secret traditions, form together the Japanese equivalent of the products of the Polish underground press, a superficially less visible and hidden side of book production. To ignore them is to leave huge areas of literary creativity and of knowledge production in Japan neglected, and that is, to my mind, a distortion that needs to be remedied. Thank you for your attention.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Chelsea Foxwell, the director of the Center for East Asian Studies, and I'm going to be, I don't think Peter really needs any help, but I'm going to be helping by moderating the Q&A. So does anyone have any questions? Yes, way in the back. And please wait for the mic to come around because we're recording this session.
You mentioned one book in the present that is listed for sale.
Yeah.
Presumably at a precious price. Do you have any idea how much manuscripts or books sold back in the time before they became antiquarian objects for collectors? Were any of these sold?
They certainly were sold. We've got records of the stock of booksellers. We've also got books that were sold and have the stamps of booksellers or the stamps of commercial lending libraries in them. In those cases, you can be sure that they were sold through some kind of public shop or other institution which was commercially passing books on. But I've got no idea of the percentage that were sold in that way. All I know is that they were a normal part of the stock of booksellers and lending libraries. We've got, for example, catalogues of those lending libraries, and you can work through the titles and see which are manuscripts and which were printed. You can also find some copies which have those stamps or seals of booksellers and so on. So what the balance was, I don't know, but there was a very substantial trade in these manuscripts, and you can still acquire them. Some of you may be wondering if these are valuable. Well, I acquired most of them in a rather scruffy bookshop in Tokyo, which I discovered only last year, which has piles and piles of them, so I just grabbed them. They were 2,000 yen each. What's that, $10? Nothing. So I can't give any more precise information about that. The full inventory of manuscripts is going to be years away. One needs to examine a lot and find evidence of where they were copied, how they were acquired, and it's going to be a long process. Let me just mention one poem which rather amusingly talks of a commercial itinerant lending library walking around the clients, and the poem says he goes around with his books on his back, and in the bottom drawer he has scandals. So that is an indication that this was just a normal part of the stock in trade of booksellers, lending libraries, and so on.
Thank you. Yes?
I have a question about printed. My question is about printed material and standardization practices of how characters were formed or how a book was bound or its dimensions, and were those standardization practices largely developed by the market itself, or would those have come from the government down into the market?
Right. A lot of the standardizations we take for granted in contemporary Japan, like the fact that the syllabary has one symbol for each syllable, simply did not apply in pre-modern Japan. So if you wrote an individual syllable such as ka, now there's only one way of writing that. Well, technically two, but let's just not get complicated. One way of writing it, there's a standard form of that syllable to represent that syllable. But in the Edo period, there were 5 or 6, and a great deal of variation orthographically could be found in every book that was written in Japanese. a different set of criteria apply in the case of Chinese books. But in the case of Japanese books, there's a great deal of variety in the representation of the sounds of Japanese, and that makes it very hard for contemporary Japanese and also for students of Japanese to read this material. Leaving aside the fact that it's written and you have to get used to the handwriting, there's the fact that there's this variety, you can call it elegant variety if you like, of usage of the syllabary. So there really isn't a standardization of the written text, particularly when you consider that just about every Japanese text was printed from somebody's handwriting. So each printed book, like that one I showed you in the penultimate slide, actually has somebody's calligraphic personality, with the result that since those ways of expressing the personality calligraphically changed over time, you can, with experience, open a book and say whether this was printed in the 17th century or the 18th century or 19th century, because the characteristics stand out very clearly. So there really aren't standardizations of writing. There are some standardizations the way in which the text is framed, since for woodblock printing purposes it's easier to print if there's a raised edge around the text. So most of the, let me go back one slide. Can I go back? Yes. So you can see at the top there that line. In fact, there's a line on all four sides. So the paper would then rest on those lines and make it easier to obtain a uniform impression from the raised text. So that's one element of standardization of the presentation of text. As for binding, there was a fairly standard form of binding used commercially throughout the Edo period, but nevertheless scrolls continued to be made. There's one on the table over there, and that wasn't the only binding that was in use, particularly, for example, for Buddhist religious texts. A kind of concertina format was used, and that became quite standard. So that there isn't any one standard form that's applied. Paper also is not standardized. There were some forms of paper which were cheap and used for a lot of commercial editions, but at the top end far superior types of paper were used. And the very best manuscripts used the kind of paper that was never used for printing because it was far too expensive. Does that answer what you're getting at? Okay. You can call me afterwards if you...
Thank you. Yes.
Hi. Hello.
Hello.
Hi. Thank you so much for your talk. This was wonderful. I have a question that's a little bit inspired by your citation of Rachel Scarborough King's book, After Print. So I know in an earlier book of hers, she talks about 18th century Britain's reliance on letters to accustom readers to print. She talks about them as a kind of bridge genre. And so since you bring up some of the genres that persisted in manuscript in your talk, that is like travel literature, science, military science, secret knowledge, I wonder what genres you see as supporting the gradual adoption of print in the Edo period, and also if the post and letters played any role in mediating the transition or back and forth between the two media forms.
Okay, that's an interesting question. I think I would like to draw a distinction in answering that between Chinese books and Japanese books, because from the very beginning of the Edo period, in fact from before, Chinese books tended to be consumed in print. If they weren't printed in Japan, they were imported copies from Korea or China, and those copies had reliability, and they also came with authoritative commentaries that explained the text. Knowing Chinese texts, particularly the canonical texts of Confucianism, was important for a lot of people in Japanese society, even, for example, in villages. Let me just give you a concrete example. A village head, if there had been a bad harvest because the weather had been poor, would need to make an appeal to the samurai authorities for a drop in the tax rate. And that kind of appeal could only be made using the kind of language that samurai would appreciate, the moral arguments that they would appreciate. And that kind of language and the arguments would be found in these sorts of texts. So a small class of people who filled the role of village head, mostly men, but in a few cases also women, needed not only to be literate, but needed also to have a command of these Chinese texts. They were difficult. And so Japanese editions came equipped with all these kind of aids that initially were glosses, later resumes and translations of the text that enabled them to read them. So the familiarization with print really came through Chinese texts. An awful lot of the Japanese text, however, circulated in multiple forms. So I would answer that familiarization came through access and the opportunity to see Chinese texts. If you look at the catalogues that the Kyoto booksellers published from the 1660s onwards, the overwhelming bulk of those is Chinese texts, which were reprinted time and time again. The back of the catalogues are Japanese texts, which in many cases were just printed once and then became unavailable. So that's my answer to the first part of your question. The second part about post and letters. Well, yes, there was a postal system, and you could get letters delivered around Japan from the 17th century onwards, if not earlier. But I'm not sure that it played any particular role, given that handwriting was so much a part of printed books as well, printed books like that one. So for a lot of Japanese readers, this was the kind of writing that they were used to, and it very much resembled handwriting. However, this is a man's handwriting, and what women needed if they were learning how to write, as Professor Hoyt-Long has most eloquently written, was access to examples of women's handwriting. And in fact, the Regenstein Library has 2 examples of manuals of handwriting for women, which necessarily had to be written by a woman. So for women, it would be that kind of book that would give them access to the kind of writing style they needed to use. But the overwhelming majority of books printed in Japanese in this way from woodblocks and therefore reproduce handwriting is actually a man's hand, not a woman's hand. Does that more or less answer your question? A bit.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes, Susan.
Hi. Yeah. Thank you so much for this talk. I really enjoyed it and I learned a lot. You mentioned that you've been visiting prefectural libraries and discovering a wealth of manuscript works that don't appear in the big Kokusho database. And I was wondering about the nature of those works. Are they these kinds of common reader type works that had a local readership, or are they works that circulated widely that were being copied because of the expense or lack of access? Could you tell us a little bit more about what you're finding in these?
Thank you, Susan. Yeah, most recently I went to Tottori, which is on the Japan Sea side of Japan, and I have to confess my sole reason for going to Tottori Prefecture was that it was the only prefecture I had never been to. Of course, it has a library and an archive, so I went to both of those. The library had a whole lot of, and this was something I had not seen before, books on horses. That is, horses as used in warfare, but also relating to the care of horses, so veterinary studies. These were part of a secret tradition, and so they were not written by common writers. But there were also, I'm not really sure what to call them, collections of monjo, collections of documents which have been bound together. So a village head, for example, who had some sense of legal precedent, might gather together and sometimes copy out relevant documents to make a compilation that would include everything on for example, a dispute with a neighbouring village on the boundaries, and so on. So these are the kind of things that a man called Kudo in Japan has written an interesting study of those kind of documents, which are really grouped together and become treated as and look like books. They're bound together, they have covers, they have the title on the cover. There are that sort of thing at a village level, but also in Fujisawa, south of Tokyo, I came across a 32-volume manuscript miscellany that really consisted of mostly extracts from the books that this innkeeper was reading. His own personal library survives, and most of the books are not there, so he was clearly borrowing these books from other people. So this is full of little bits of extracts that he found interesting, and then there are little passages which say what his neighbour told him about what's going on in Edo. Just a whole mass of information, but there's an awful lot that is derived from books. It's a miscellany and extremely interesting as a reflection of what this one individual could come across and could also find interesting. Those are just a couple of examples, but in my experience, just about any city level or prefectural level and sometimes town level library or archive has a wealth of stuff that is not included in that database, and is often of a great interest, has not been studied, and I'm always welcomed when I go there by showing an interest in it.
Hello. I was wondering, in the process of reproducing these manuscript books, what was the rate of corruption or deliberate falsification of, the previous copies? So, for example, if a poet wanted to attribute one of his own works to an illustrious predecessor, or some Bowdlerization or something like this.
Yeah, I would have to have several lifetimes to look at a lot of these manuscripts. But you gave two examples. One is just scribal error, and another is deliberate falsification. There is also, in fact, deliberate addition to manuscripts, which happens a great deal in terms of trying to bring them up to date or add further information. And very often you have a manuscript which combines the two. The question of deliberate falsification is not something I've actually encountered, because to do that I would really have to have the copy in front of me that the copyist had in front of him or her, and I don't have that. And very little attempt in Japan has been made to study manuscripts from these perspectives. So, as you saw from that copy of Political Discussions, copyists were certainly very well aware of the danger of errors creeping in, and did attempt to correct those by looking at a better copy whenever they had the chance to come across them. Those kind of comments you do encounter quite frequently. So this process was being done in full knowledge of the possibility of errors, and sometimes also awareness of the fact that the text was difficult to understand and they may not have understood it. There is a classic case of that goes back to the 13th century, when one of the most famous poets in Japanese history was copying a text that had been produced 100 years earlier, and the original manuscript had survived, and he couldn't actually read it. So what he did was copy the letters. These were all Japanese hiragana syllabic letters, as closely to the original as he could, so that he could later work it over and try and figure out what it was that the original was saying. So the practice of doing a copy that actually reproduces the calligraphy was also a way of reproducing elements in the text that you don't necessarily understand. But I can't give you any answer about the frequency of things. That will have to wait.
So I have a question kind of following on that. So how do people today go about learning to read these texts?
With difficulty. No, I think you run a course. Don't you? I mean, for Chicago students, there's one course that you run, isn't there, Chelsea?
Well, Dr. Susan Burns, yes, founded the Kazushiji Reading Group. I'm a lucky member.
Oh,
and
sorry.
yes, we actually read one of the texts that you showed, Ehon Yamato Hiji.
Yes, right.
Yeah. Oh, did you know that?
I did know that. Yes.
Well, I thought it was just a coincidence among all the tens of thousands of books in the world. But that's nice to know. So yes, we meet on Friday over Zoom, and we actually have members from all over the country at different universities all over the country, both graduate students and professors. But we would be remiss not to talk about the AI that are being developed, right? So Professor Akama from Ritsumeikan came a number of years ago and introduced us to the AI system, you know, and they basically make it read many, many things, and then, you know, it's able to give suggestions. And he emphasized that it was still necessary to have people who could read in order to process the results of the AI and the suggestions of the AI. But there's also a lot of crowd reading activities that are going on, so that this AI can also be networked with a database where people can collaborate on projects, right? And I have to say that my knowledge of these are now several years old. So with AI, it seems like every month we need to check for new developments. So I don't know if you have
yeah, I mean, I have tried using the AI in app form, but if I'm really honest, I have never found that it produced a reading I was convinced of. Largely because the app really has no knowledge of the context, and much better help is knowing the context, knowing the kind of formulaic expressions that occur that help you. So when I'm really stuck, I give AI a miss and write to a friend of mine in Tokyo who is pretty reliable, but there are even times when he can't read things. So I mean, the skill of reading these things easily, such things that's on the table, has really been lost. And remember that these books were read by ordinary people who were just used to handwriting. They're much more used to this form of writing than they were to square, easy to read print. And we have to try to recover that as we deal with these things. And when I started, of course this is many moons ago, but when I started you had to do it yourself. But now there are lots of reference books, and there are these groups, there's crowdsourcing, there are a lot of aids that you can draw upon. But ultimately the responsibility, you know, is yours for getting it right.
Thank you. Just to sort of follow up real quick, do you find that there's a lot of regional dialects coming off in these works, depending on where the books are originating from?
No, very little. Mostly they're written in standard literary Japanese, and there's very little trace of dialectal variation. The exception would be if dialogue's used, but mostly dialogue is not used in these books, except the fictionalized versions of Scandals, which do include dialogue. There you can find dialect, yes.
Thank you. Maybe time for one or two more. I know that Professor Harper over here has a question.
Hi, thank you very much for your very interesting speech. I really enjoyed it. I believe you mentioned that this example was written by a man, so I was wondering, how do you know that it was written by a man? Is the name on it somewhere?
No, I don't know that. There isn't a name. There are sometimes, in the case of particularly finely written texts, at the end you will find the name not only of the author and illustrator and printer, but also the name of the person who has written out the text. But then it has to be calligraphically special, and those names are always male. I don't know of any case where such a text was written by a woman, except for the works which were written for women to copy, and there it necessarily had to be in a woman's hand.
Thank you very much.
I'm told we can go a few more minutes. I also want to give people time to look at the books, but Professor Harper?
This is related to a problem I've had with research on China, but I've encountered it in Japan too. And it's to want to ask a sort of large question. about what happens to the manuscript and woodblock book tradition of the literature as it transitions into metal, movable type, modern editions, which in China at least, by the 20s, 30s was prolific and more or less replaced the use of the earlier editions. And what I found in one case, in something I was doing in Japan, was that the only edition I could find of a certain literates, and he was from Kyoto, notes. It was like scholarly notes on a wide variety of topics. And, there were just distortions. It was garbled. The text made no sense. And nobody could say anything about it. And I was in Kyoto once, and it turned out that the Kyoto University Library had the auto manuscript of the man himself. And we looked it up. And not only was it the case of someone who did the typesetting in whatever decade of the early 20th century to modern movable type, simply couldn't read the graphs. And the other problem was that the formatting of the manuscript included sort of marginal notes that weren't just commentary, but were actually part of how this literati had just composed the page. And that had been garbled in the modern movable typeset edition. And so what I found with China is that often there is this kind of gap, kind of lost between pre-modern and modern, in the sense of this transition from manuscript woodblock over to movable type and mass production. And then people don't look back, and yet in a way we can't rely on a lot of what was transposed into modern movable type print editions. And how you see this with respect to Japan, I'm just curious.
Okay, that's a massive question.
Exactly. Because most of us don't look back.
We'll take another half hour. How should I start? The first thing is that these manuscript traditions did not stop with the introduction of modern movable type printing in the 1860s, 1870s. It's true that by the end of the 1880s, for the printing of novels and most books, modern movable type had replaced woodblock printing. But it hadn't replaced it, for example, in the reproduction of Buddhist texts and a number of other areas. And manuscript production continued. For example, one of the big bestsellers of the period around the Meiji Restoration, 1868 and so on, was a book by Fukuzawa Yukichi called Conditions in the West. He had actually traveled to America and to Europe in the 1850s and 1860s, and was one of the few Japanese intellectuals who had first-hand knowledge of the West. And he wrote this detailed account. It was a huge bestseller. And I found a copy in the library of a Ministry of Education official who had earlier been a senior samurai in one of the domains. So he was a person who wasn't short of money, and he was living in Tokyo. I mean, he had plenty of opportunities to get the printed book. So I ordered up the book to see what it was, and I found that he had a manuscript. And my guess is he had made a manuscript copy of this book because the contents were so startling that he wanted to embody them. He wanted to reproduce the kind of learning patterns he would have had as a young man when he'd been copying texts in order to absorb them, like Trithemius, whom I mentioned before. So that's one thing. But the traditions of doing things by hand lasted well into the 20th century, as Hoyt Long has shown, but actually even later, though this doesn't often appear in Japanese books, because throughout the Second World War, Japanese troops in the field received their orders in handwriting. This was because taking a Japanese typewriter into the field was just out of the question. They were too large, too cumbersome, and it took too long to compose a text. So what they used instead was a Japanese variant of the Roneo machine, which was invented in the US and shown at the 1904 St. Louis exhibition, if I'm not mistaken. And a Japanese was at the exhibition, noted the technology and adapted it for use with Japanese using a stylus instead of a typewriter on the stencil sheet. And that way, handwriting could be reproduced, like roneoed. I mean, I'm giving away my age by talking about roneos, but anyway. And so you could reproduce handwriting. And throughout the war, that is how orders were given. And there's an irony in an encounter that a British Army officer had in Burma in July 1945, when he received a whole lot of Japanese military orders that had been gathered. And he read them and found that one was of extreme importance because it gave the plans for the Japanese breakout in Burma going eastwards to escape from the Allied armies. And he got out his typewriter and put it into print immediately and typing. Whereas the original, of course, was handwritten. So that sort of tradition of handwriting things, public important documents, lasted right through until 1945. But the other part of your question really related to the unreliability of the transition.
Most of us use the modern movable type. We don't even realize we're using materials that haven't been accurately shifted over.
Exactly. Yes. I can't really give a full answer to that now, but what is interesting is that a lot of the manuscripts, particularly the scandal manuscripts, the fictionalized scandal manuscripts I talked about, were put into print immediately in the Meiji period. Now they could be printed. The old regime had collapsed. And an indication of how widely they were read is the fact that these things were printed by various publishers, often simultaneously. So there was clearly a huge market for these scandal manuscripts, or former scandal manuscripts, scandal narratives, that lasted right through until about 1890 or so. So the transition was made very, very quickly, and these are mostly accurate transcriptions of individual manuscripts. There are some small differences because, of course, the manuscripts differed, and a lot of editing has been done to introduce more Chinese characters, to make them look more like Meiji period novels, 19th century novels, with a large number of Chinese characters. So some editorial work was done on them, but that transition was done very quickly. There's a lot more to say, but I better leave it at that, to give somebody else it.
Well, I think we're pretty much at time. So many people to thank. The Division of the Humanities and the Paleography in the book program, the wonderful staff have been amazing in putting this together. President Hannah Holborn Gray for sponsoring this amazing program. And of course, please join me in thanking Dr. Peter Kornicki for his wonderful talk. Thank you.